Above all giant battles, the Battle of Stalingrad now stands like a monument. It will remain in our memory as the greatest heroic battle. Unparalleled is what is being done there now by our sappers, infantrymen, artillerymen, anti-aircraft gunners, and all who fight in this city, from the general to the last private. So spoke Göring on January 30th, 1943. Millions of Germans, sitting at the radios, listened to the Reichsmarschall. From these words of his, they clenched their hearts, stopped breathing in their chests, blood ran cold in their veins. They were gripped by a chilling horror. What about our husbands, fathers, sons? What is happening to the German soldiers in this vulgar city? Until 2 weeks ago, military reports tried to hide the encirclement of the Sixth Army. Only in the last phase of the battle in the encirclement, Goebbels' propaganda began little by little to lift the veil of secrecy, which was shrouded in this monstrous slaughter of people. But it did it in its own way. Turning into an apotheosis, the death sentence actually passed on the Sixth Army and units of the Fourth Panzer Army. Military reports were full of such verbal embellishments as heroic struggle, immortal glory, valiant resistance, indestructible courage. Shamelessly distorting the historical truth, Göring compared what was happening with the famous defensive battle of 300 Spartans at Thermopylae in 480 BC. The Sixth German Army, which, capturing and destroying everything in its path, invaded more than 2,000 kilometers deep into the Soviet Union, was likened, contrary to all historical facts, to that small detachment that once defended in a narrow mountain passage of his homeland from the Persian invaders, and by analogy with the inscription on one of the rocks of this gorge, "Traveller, if you come to Sparta, say that we fell here, as the law commanded." In German history, it will also be said, "If you return to Germany, say that you saw us fighting in Stalingrad, as the law commanded." Unfortunately, the Nazi rulers succeeded, in fact, in realizing their sacrilegious plan. Only 3 weeks later, Goebbels could already in his speech on February 18, 1943 in Sportpalast, with truly demonic dexterity to present the death of the Sixth Army in the halo of proud sorrow and use it to proclaim total war. The Germans who fell in battle, who died of starvation on the Volga, as well as the survivors in Soviet prisoner-of-war camps, and there were no such Germans, according to Goebbels' propaganda, were all shamelessly used by Goebbels' propaganda, so that the Nazis could continue their war crimes. Proclaiming the slogan, "So rise up, people, and let the storm blow," Goebbels drew applause and ended his speech to the endless chorus of select Nazi choruses, "Command, Führer, we follow you." From now on, the fateful course of events was predetermined. It led to the greatest catastrophe of the German nation. The efforts of the German soldier at the Battle of the Volga were incredible. He fought bravely, steadfastly, selflessly. 76 days and nights he looked into the eyes of death, because every second threatened him with death weapon of the bravest and most determined enemy. For 76 days and nights he endured the most severe hardships, struggled against excruciating hunger and bitter cold. Indeed, the sacrifices made personally by every German soldier and officer are indisputable. But that is not what we are talking about here. It is a question of the meaning of these sacrifices. What law commanded these men to advance all the way to the Volga, bringing with them death, suffering, and destruction? What law required them to go to their deaths? And can we honor their sacrifices? I participated in the Battle of the Volga and came out of it alive. It was a profound turning point in my long life. I am now in my 70s. It was painful and bitter for me, a cadre officer, to come to the realization that I had served faithfully and truthfully for an unjust cause, and, as an officer of the armed forces, was responsible for it. Only in the long process of revision of the past and spiritual reincarnation, which led to severe internal conflicts and contradictions, did I gradually realize the deep reasons for our defeat. It was not the result of frost, not the lack of roads, not the gigantic expanse of Russia, and not the result of strategic or tactical errors of the military command. from the OKV to the Front Command, or the errors of Hitler alone, as numerous memoirists are increasingly trying to convince us. Nor was it caused by a stab in the back or other factors that can be disregarded. It was a consequence of the ruinous invasive policy of German imperialism and militarism, to which the army of the world's first socialist state gave a crushing repulse. But what is the price of insight and repentance before the judgment of history, if they remain only a thought or a word? Dicite moniti, dicite. You whom I warn, heed the lesson, for it demands right action. Only in this way can we free ourselves from the burden of responsibility for the evil we have done. Only by giving all of ourselves to the struggle against the repetition of past mistakes can we face the judgment of history, be worthy to answer for the dead, not to sin before our conscience. In this, I know, we are quite unanimous with my friend and co-author Otto Ruhler, who, like me, being a participant of the battle on the Volga, and having overcome internal conflicts, correctly conceptualized the experience. As a good comrade, he helped me with his characteristic thoroughness, clarity, and energy to finish the story of my life, the first drafts of which I made 20 years ago. The officers of the Operations Department of the 6th Army Headquarters were talking, sitting in their canteen. Lunch was already over. We were still waiting for the Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal General von Reichenau. There was nothing unusual about this. Reichenau was not known for his punctuality outside of duty. He happened to show up at the table in a tracksuit. He could not be bothered with that. We knew that morning, as usual, accompanied by his young adjutant, Oberleutnant Kettler, he was practicing riding and shooting. From this he was probably delayed. Reichenau's habits were familiar to us, so we were not surprised by his late arrival. But we were struck by something else. He walked to the table with a stiff gait, as if he could hardly stand on his feet. And if he always ate willingly with appetite, today he was only picking at his plate with his fork. At the same time he moaned a little. This noticed Colonel Geim, Chief of Staff of the Army. He looked anxiously at Reichenau. "Are you not feeling well, Mr. Field Marshal?" "Don't worry, Heim, it will soon pass, don't mind me." At that moment a messenger called me into the corridor. Colonel Justice Neumann was waiting there. "Please tell the Field Marshal that I need him to sign some papers urgently. The mail must be sent today to the General Command of the Ground Forces." When I relayed this to Reichenau, he replied that he asked Colonel Neumann to wait a few minutes. I went out to settle the question of the deadline for the submission of some documents. In the front room I talked some more with Neumann and one of our resident officers. Then the door opened and Reichenau appeared. He signed the papers handed to him. Behind him stood a servant, preparing to give him his overcoat. But he did not have to do it. Field Marshal suddenly staggered. We managed to pick up his heavy falling body. Not yet recovered from the fright, a few seconds later I stood in the dining room of the club in front of the Chief of Staff. "Mr. Colonel, Field Marshal." Stunned, everyone ran out into the front room. Field Marshal General, not long ago, full of energy and vitality, was now lying helplessly in the arms of two residents. His as if extinguished eyes stared intently into the void. Apparently, he was unconscious. Chief of Medical Service of the 6th Army Dr. Flade, 2 days before the incident went on a business trip to Dresden, so I called the chief physician of the hospital in Poltava. We took Field Marshal in an automobile to his apartment. The doctor who arrived diagnosed paralysis with a lesion of the central nervous system. He shook his head worriedly. The right arm and the right half of Reichenau's face were paralyzed. Colonel Heim immediately let the General Command of the Land Forces and Hitler's headquarters know what had happened. After all, Reichenau was the commander of both Army Group South and the 6th Army. Now both were left without leadership. This was all the more unpleasant that the Soviet troops were now conducting a successful offensive on the flanks of our army. When Dr. Flade was nevertheless summoned by telegram from Dresden, Geim suggested to the OKH, in addition, to bring biplane to Poltava Professor Horrifying, who was Reichenau's house physician in Leipzig. At that moment, Horrifying was on the northern front. On January 16th, Professor Horrifying and Dr. Flade arrived in Poltava by plane. Reichenau's condition by this time had deteriorated considerably. The diagnosis read, deep cerebral hemorrhage. In the evening of January 16th, it seemed that there was a slight improvement. The Concilium of Doctors decided to take advantage of this to transport Reichenau to Leipzig, to the clinic of Professor Hochrein, if only at all, and there would be able to help so seriously ill. January 17th, 1942. At 8:30, 2 planes started. Field Marshal did not live to see this moment. He died just before departure. In one car, Dr. Flade accompanied the deceased, in the other flew Professor Horrifying. About 11 o'clock, Lemberg appeared in sight, where fuel was to be gained. The plane with Reichenau's body went to land too late, crashed directly into a hangar on the airfield, and crashed to pieces. Field Marshal's body was so disfigured that his remains had to be bandaged. Dr. Flade's left arm was broken. Shortly after the accident, February 11th, 1942, he wrote in a letter to General Paulus, "My pilot thought that in Lemberg he would be more convenient to land, and on the fly turned just where at 11:30 a.m., and had a disaster in this attempt." It is truly a miracle that we all did not crash to death, especially if you look at what happened to the plane. Hitler ordered to organize a solemn funeral for Field Marshal Reichenau at the expense of the state. As a representative of the Sixth Army at the funeral ceremony, attended by Major General von Schuler, former for many years, Adjutant Reichenau. The fierce fighting that had begun in the meantime made it impossible for any of the division chiefs of our headquarters to leave the field. The leadership of Army Group South was entrusted to Field Marshal von Bock. January 20th, 1942, he began his duties as commander. On the same day arrived in Poltava and Lieutenant General Paulus, the newly appointed commander of the Sixth Army. Caused by the death of Reichenau, interregnum ended. Both commanders faced difficult tasks. Red Army units knocked out the 294th Infantry Division from its positions near Volchansk, northeast of Kharkov. As a result of the offensive on both sides of Izium at the junction of the 17th and 6th Armies, the Soviet troops had cut deeply into our positions. We had no reserves. Kharkov, Poltava and Dnepropetrovsk were under threat. From those divisions that were not hit were allocated infantry battalions, artillery divisions, and moved to the south to strengthen the right flank of the army. From the army rear area was hastily advanced Guard Division, which did not have heavy weapons. It was to hold east of Poltava, the tip of the advancing Soviet wedge. Consolidated battalions made up of rear units were supposed to be used for the direct defence of the threatened cities. The position of the army was by no means brilliant when I met Paulus at the airfield. He stood before me, tall, slender. At first he listened to my report with restraint, then a smile appeared on his thin face. "A Hessian too?" "Yes, Mr. General," I replied. "Well then, Adam, you and I will get together quickly." Then Paulus said hello to his old acquaintance, Captain Dormeyer, head of the officers' casino, who came with me to the airfield. When we got into the car, Paulus first thing he asked, "How is it at the front?" "I am familiar with yesterday's evening summary of the army. Has anything changed since then?" "We are extremely concerned about the question whether the weak defence front, created from hastily assembled units, can withstand the growing onslaught of the Red Army. Nucci Staber is very pleased to see you." Paulus immediately went to Colonel Game, Chief of Staff of the Sixth Army. Game, together with other officers of the staff, thoroughly prepared for the report to the new commander. On the operational map were put on the latest data, calculated the losses we suffered in recent days. The head of the operational department and the head of the intelligence department reported on the number, combat experience, and combat effectiveness of our units. Then they characterized the composition of the Soviet troops and reported the latest intelligence data. Colonel Heim proposed to unite under one command those combat groups, which so far were part of different regiments and divisions, but performed the same task. The choice fell on the General of Artillery Geitz, commanding the 8th Army Corps. Paulus knew him as a steadfast soldier. He could be relied on. Geitz really in a short period of time achieved the coherence of the actions of these battle groups. He significantly strengthened them with a clear organisation of artillery fire and forced construction of defensive positions. 113th Infantry Division was transferred to the VE Army Corps and also put into battle with the front to the south at the breakthrough point south of Kharkov. It seemed that the danger was averted. In these days I repeatedly had to see how conscientiously Paulus works. He was alien to the swagger peculiar to the later Reichenau. Every phrase that Paulus said or wrote was accurately weighed, clearly expressed his thought, so that did not cause any doubt. If Reichenau was a commander who easily, without fear of responsibility, made decisions, and his particularly characteristic features were firmness, indestructible will and courage, Paulus was the complete opposite. Even as a young officer, he received in the comradeship environment nickname Cunctatora, slow. His sharp as a blade mind, his invincible logic earned him the respect of all the staff. I do not remember such a case when he underestimated the enemy and overestimated his own strength and capabilities. His decision matured only after a long, sober discussion, only after a thorough exchange of opinions with the officers of the staff, during which carefully weighed all conceivable contingencies. In relations with his subordinates, Paulus was benevolent and invariably correct chief. For the first time I was convinced of this when I travelled with him to the headquarters of his subordinate corps and divisions. On February 28th in the afternoon, I was informed by the Chief of Staff that I would accompany Paulus on March 1st during his trip to the front. Here, as if by the way, he handed me a list of those who had received the next ranks by courier from the personnel department. The Chief of Staff, congratulating me, extended his hand to me. Since March 1st, 1942, I was promoted to colonel. I inform you today, so that tomorrow morning you could report about it before leaving to the commander. In a year you went from major to colonel, you can be proud of that. And I was really proud at the time. I quickly made the necessary clarifications on my operational map. Nachistaba familiarized me with the route. Our trip was to last 3 or 4 days. On the next morning, at about 8 o'clock, we left on a passenger all-terrain vehicle of the brand Kubel to the compounds at the place of the breakthrough, east of Poltava. We were accompanied by several liaison motorcyclists. It was a clear, frosty morning. Even fur coats did not save us from the penetrating east wind. The road was often blocked by snowdrifts. Columns of soldiers and locals were able to clear the road only from the biggest blockages, and even then not for long. Walls of snow almost 4 meters high on the sides of the road limited the view. Only somewhere glimpsed gaps allowed to see the wide Ukrainian steppe spread before my eyes, like a deserted land of snow whose crystals sparkled sometimes in the sun like diamonds. Trees and bushes appeared only occasionally near the bed of streams and in villages between low whitewashed huts covered with thatch or shingles. On bare branches, ruffled crows were crowing. On the way, Paulus began to tell about his fears and hopes. "When I took command of the 6th Army 6 weeks ago," said Paulus, "I was somewhat concerned about how my relations with the corps commanders will be. After all, they are all older than me, and years, and ranks." "I was thinking about it myself," I answered. "But now, after what I have heard from corps adjutants, I have the impression that you enjoy great authority here." "That's right, Adam. I think I've found the right tone, too. I want to use this trip to establish an even closer bond with the people. After all, the task of a commander of troops is to create with his subordinates a relationship built on sincere trust, and the prerequisite for this is to know each other well. This will make leadership much easier. Have you already had to deal personally with corps commanders?" Colonel Heim introduced me to the corps commanders in the first days after my arrival. I do not know all the division commanders yet. So far, I could only judge them by their service characteristics. Use these few days for a closer acquaintance. We will visit many divisions. It would be desirable that you, when we return, write your impressions of the commanders. I will try, Mr. General, to talk to some regimental commanders as well. It is true that all of them have service characteristics, but I would like to form my own opinion about them. This is both right and necessary. I think that in the current year we still have heavy battles ahead of us. When replacing outgoing commanders, I must rely on your suggestions. Wrong choice in replacing a commander inevitably entails harmful consequences for the military unit. So take a close look at each one. We were coming down some hill. The car skidded, and it turned around its axis several times. It took the driver a while to get over it. Naturally, the conversation was interrupted. Our attention was drawn to the smooth-as-a-mirror, icy road. First, we went to the division commander, Lieutenant General Gabka, to whom the military unit on the Western Bulge was subordinated. After receiving brief information about the situation and the actions of the units, Paulus inspected the artillery positions. They were in the open, were neither protected by trenches nor camouflaged, therefore they could easily be detected by the enemy. This was inexcusable. Paulus talked with gunners and gun commanders. Are the guns in order? Is there enough ammunition? That's right, Mr. General, answered one of the gun commanders. Where are the foreparts and horses? The horses are over there in the barns. The foreparts are near them. The artilleryman pointed to the village located only a few hundred meters away. The commander again turned to the gun commander. Do you think this is a favorable position? Why are the guns not camouflaged? Very close by stood huge haystacks. Why don't you use these piles of straw? The battery commander came running up to us. He was obviously afraid of being overtaken. But Paulus was not one of those formidable chiefs who affect only a shout, although in this case he could get angry, because the battery commander lightly put the lives of his soldiers at risk. I was just talking to your gunners about the gun positions. You can see them right here. If the enemy were to renew the attack, there would probably be nothing left of your battery in a few minutes. Change positions tonight and cover your guns with straw? He spoke calmly, persuasively, in a comradely tone. The battery commander stood at attention before him with his right hand on his visor. Yes, Mr. General. He was so bewildered that he could not think of anything else to say. All right. Put things in order. With these words, Paulus left the stunned officer. We again sat in the car and again desperately cold, in spite of our fur coats. The following conversation we had in the area of location of Voi Army Corps, in the settlement to the south of Kharkov. For some time, Paulus did not say a word. He was busy with his thoughts. Suddenly he looked at me. I do not understand why Timoshenko 9 does not continue the offensive. Defensive position, which you and I have just examined, would not resist a decisive blow. I have already noticed this when we stood in artillery positions. It was enough to exchange a few words with the observer officer who had set up a stereo telescope on a straw pile. He calmly asserted that the Russians were freezing just as we were, and that they would not advance now. They, like us, are entrenched in the villages. It is true, the fight is now more or less for the settlements, but we must take into account that the Russians are much better adapted to winter than we are, that they may suddenly come again. At any rate, our headquarters at Poltava is still threatened. I, Herr General, am of the opinion that Timoshenko is exhausted. Otherwise he would still take advantage of the situation favourable to him. I don't share your opinion, Adam. The Russians act systematically. They will not go lightly at 15. Risk. I think we will discuss this issue tonight thoroughly. Listen before. How assesses the situation? General Geitz. He has long been on this section of the front. Geitz was waiting for us. He was small in stature, well built. Protruding lower jaw gave his narrow face some cruel expression. I was interested in how Paulus would discuss the situation. He could not be satisfied with a superficial characterization of the situation at the front. Being an experienced general staff, he sought to get an accurate picture of the situation. asked about sources of information about the Soviet army, instantly penetrated into the essence of the matter, was able to separate the unimportant from the main, discussed and weighed the various options for Russian actions, and demanded an appropriate solution to the problem. General Geitz emphasized the power of Soviet tank units, then summarized, "If the Russians gather here a strike fist, we will not be able to hold Kharkov. The danger will threaten the Sixth Army from the rear. We lack large-caliber anti-tank guns. I ask you to provide me with several batteries of anti-aircraft guns of 8.8 caliber. They would give us the opportunity to repel the attack of enemy tanks." Paulus quite realized what danger threatened German troops in Kharkov. Certainly it was necessary to check earlier whether it is possible and what exactly anti-aircraft batteries to allocate for General Geitz. Turning to him, Paulus said, "When I arrive in Kharkov, I will talk to the Chief of Staff of the Army. I hope we can help you." In Kharkov, ordinarians were waiting for us. We took an apartment in small houses on the outskirts. Both rooms and the kitchen were furnished cosily, and the main thing, especially after this trip in the bitter cold, we felt a pleasant warmth. We had dinner together at Paulus's apartment. I lived next door in a neighbouring house. We were served potato pancakes and real coffee. After dinner we sat together for a long time. The commander resumed the conversation he had begun during the day. "As I told you, Adam, I do not share your 16th opinion that the combat effectiveness of the Red Army has decreased. Near Moscow, the Russians not only delayed our tanks, but even, as you know, went on the offensive December 5, 1941 on the Kalinin front, far away from our troops and inflicted on us a very sensitive damage 10. I observed this first period while still in the headquarters of the ground forces. I thought deeply about the situation anew, Mr. General. The Reds really showed at Moscow what even greater opportunities they have. They quickly found our vulnerabilities, broke through our positions and pushed us to the deep rear. I wrote to me about this General Schubert, whose adjutant I was until last November. His 23rd Army Corps was many days in encirclement near Rzhev. Only by straining the last of his strength he managed to withdraw his troops. Many points that we captured at great cost are now lost, such as Toropets. Yes, Adam, at Rzhev the situation is extremely complicated. In addition, we lost a lot of valuable material. The Russian offensive on the Central Front created great difficulties for the general command of the land forces. It was not clear how to close the gaping holes of the breakthrough. You yourself understand that I am extremely worried about the situation of our army. Timoshenko's army, which broke through at Izium, threatens our deep flank south of Kharkov. The forces opposing Timoshenko's army are unable to repel the new offensive. The danger to the northeast of Kharkov near Volchansk has not yet been eliminated. New forces have not yet arrived for reinforcements, so that we may find ourselves in circumstances in which we have to hold our present positions, relying on the compounds already operating there. Moreover, with their help, we can sooner eliminate the enemy's inroads. Until this is done, we are in an extremely dangerous position 11. Before us lay a map. On it were drawn the latest data operational summary. Paulus spoke by telephone with the Chief of Staff on the motion of General Geitz, that south of Kharkov, to be used for anti-tank defense anti-aircraft guns, 17 caliber, 8.8. Chief of Staff informed the commander about the situation in other parts of the front of the army. I listened absent-mindedly. Our conversation with Paulus is not too conducive to my mental equilibrium. I mentally reconstructed the events of today. Some of the line officers were gloomy. Many of the soldiers had no trace of their former enthusiasm, of the faith in victory that had inspired them in the first year of the war. One thing was certain. Hitler and the General Command of Land Forces consciously or unwittingly lied when they boasted before the world that the Red Army is defeated. A defeated army cannot attack in different places in the middle of winter without respite. But why these doubts? When winter is over, then things will get better. So I convinced myself. But that night I did not sleep for a long time. The next day we visited the headquarters of the 17th Army and KK's Tank Corps, deployed in Kharkov. I met the commander of the Tank Corps, General Stumer, for the first time here. In the army he was jokingly nicknamed Ball Lightning. This nickname suited the small, fat, alive as Mercury general. His tank divisions pushed back the enemy, who broke through to our positions in the northeast of Kharkov. I liked Paulus and here in conversation with corps commanders and chiefs of staff. He did not boast of his high rank and tried to convince his subordinates in the correctness of his point of view. His manner made a favourable impression on the generals. I was pleased to notice that they treated the commander with due respect. 2 days later, we left for Belgorod, the 6th Army Corps. I was excited about the upcoming data with the Chief of Staff, Colonel von Bechtolsheim. I had many months to work with him in the headquarters of the 6th Army Corps. Paulus also knew him quite intimately. During the Polish and French campaigns, Bechtolsheim was the head of the operational department of the 6th Army. We were already approaching the city when Paulus showed to the right and said, "Look, here the highway, which plays such a vital role for the supply of troops in the area of Belgorod, almost unharmed. You know that the 294th Infantry Division offered only weak resistance to the attacking enemy. Part of it, fleeing, retreated there, here to that small hill. It was possible to restore the former position only with the support of our tanks. Soon we arrived in Belgorod, and then, in the centre of the city, a terrible picture suddenly appeared before us. I was horrified. In the middle of a large square stood a gallows. On it swayed the corpses of people in civilian clothes. Paulus turned pale. The eyes of this usually calm man expressed deep indignation. He exclaimed angrily, "How dare they make their crime a public spectacle? I cancelled Reichenau's order as soon as I took up my duties. I remembered Reichenau's order very well. It happened in November 1941. I was transferred to the headquarters of the 6th Army and sent to my destination." It was immediately clear to me what kind of spirit reigned here. Right on the landing at the entrance to the operations department hung a large announcement with the text of this order, which had the following title, "On the Conduct of Troops in the Occupied Countries of Eastern Europe," and the signature, "Von Reichenau, Field Marshal General." What the order demanded of the troops was monstrous. It called for the wholesale murder of the Russian population, including women and children. This no longer had anything to do with the methods of warfare as I understood them. Reichenau's order surpassed even the order on commissars, according to which political commissars of the Soviet army were not to be treated as soldiers or prisoners of war, but were to be isolated and immediately exterminated. What was left of the Hague Convention? Having taken command of the 6th Army, Paulus cancelled Reichenau's order. Nevertheless, in Belgorod stood the gallows. Corps Commander von Obstfelder and Colonel of the General Staff von Bechtolsheim were waiting for us at the entrance to his headquarters. Paulus asked Obstfelder, "What were the civilians hanged for?" Obstfelder looked up at his superior. "The garrison commandant arrested them as hostages because many of our soldiers were found killed in the city. The hostages were hanged in the main street, for example, and intimidation." Paulus stood before the officers slightly hunched over. His face twitched nervously. He said, "And you think that this can suspend the guerrillas? And I believe that such methods achieve just the opposite. I cancelled Reichenau's order on the behaviour of troops in the east. Order this disgrace to disappear immediately." That was Paulus. Revenge and atrocity were incompatible with his concept of military honour. He cancelled Reichenau's barbaric order. But Paulus did not go further than that. True, he was deeply indignant and demanded to remove the gallows. However, the commandant of the Belgorod garrison, contrary to the order of the army commander who executed the hostages, remained unpunished. I myself did not react to this inconsistency of Paulus. On the 4th day, we returned to Poltava. More than 2 years I was not on vacation. As a result of the examination which I passed at the army therapists, Our chief doctor, Professor Haubenreiser, recommended me to ask for a legal vacation at last. Paulus granted my request, despite the tense situation. I could rely on my deputy. He was instructed by me in all matters. And even before Easter, I was going to leave the active army. The commander of the army group allowed Paulus to take leave for a few Easter days to be present in Berlin at the christening of his twin grandchildren. We travelled to the homeland together. From Poltava to Kiev, we were taken by a special train of Field Marshal von Bock. Paulus's automobile we carried on the platform. Paulus wanted to go from Kiev to Berlin in a passenger car. One of our automobile repair companies in Kiev was ordered to provide me with a passenger car to the German border. I was accompanied by a young adjutant of our headquarters. From Kiev, we, without delay, moved on. At first, everything went as if smoothly. However, by evening a strong snowstorm arose, so that we could hardly distinguish the road. We decided to spend the night in Zhytomyr and leave at dawn. But in those days I was haunted by bad luck. When the car was being refuelled in the darkness, it suddenly slipped into a ditch and the exhaust pipe of the engine broke. The next morning I went to the auto repair shop. I had to use all my eloquence to get the car fixed immediately. Only by noon were we able to get on the road again. We refuelled the tank and filled the spare canister. Luckily, the car was running well, the snowstorm had stopped. In my mind, I was already in Krakow, from where I decided to go by an echelon of vacationers going on schedule to Frankfurt am Main. In a cheerful mood, as befits a vacationer, I started a conversation with the driver, a young soldier, a mechanic by profession. "How long have you been in the army?" "Since the beginning of the war, Mr. Colonel." "And since when in the automobile repair company?" After training, I was transferred there as a repair mechanic, and I stayed with the company throughout the Western campaign. "How do you like Kiev?" "I only saw a glimpse of the city yesterday afternoon, but it made a good impression on me." "Yes, Mr. Colonel. Kiev is a beautiful city, and we have good housing here, and everything is as it should be in the auto repair shop. It would be good if it weren't so turbulent." "What do you mean?" "I wouldn't advise you to go out alone at night. A lot of soldiers and officers have gone missing since we've been here. Not from our unit. We were warned right away. When we go to the movies or to the soldiers' club in the evening, we always gather in a big group. We don't part with our weapons." "Well, well, well, the devil is not as bad as they make it out to be." "Mr. Colonel, I'm not exaggerating. There are guerrillas in the city itself. They raid the town. We'd be better off standing in some little town where the inhabitants are countless, and the best thing would be if the war were over soon." "You must miss the West, huh?" "It was nicer there in every way." "Yes, it was a good time, that's for sure." "And now you're sick of the war?" "As a matter of fact, yes, Mr. Colonel. You should hear our old soldiers swearing. Vacationers tell me that many of our soldiers were killed in the snow near Moscow. My friend brought with him from home, from his town, the local newspaper. Its whole pages are full of death notices. We drove out onto a road that had just been gravelled. Large stones, the size of my fist, rolled beneath the car. The driver slowed down, but after a few hundred metres it was already possible to go faster. We were approaching Rovno. The adjutant, sitting behind me, touched my shoulder. "Mr. Colonel, it seems that the car is again wrong. We leave a trail behind us, whether the gas tank leaks or radiator." We stopped. There was a hole in the gas tank, punctured by a rock. Gasoline was oozing out of the hole. Having filled the tank from spare jerry cans, we reached the gas station in Rivne. There was no repair shop there. The driver corked the hole and filled all the tanks again. Having used up gasoline to the last drop, we reached Peremyshl and put the car in one of the Wehrmacht workshops. The mechanic on duty at the depot said that the repairs would last at least 2 days. So I decided to go the next morning by train. A day and a half later I was in Frankfurt am Main. But this part of the journey was uneventful. A few hours later, my wife met me at the station in Münzberg, a small Hessian town near the resort of Nauheim. The very next morning I went to see my old acquaintance, the carpenter Hartmann, who had a rare subtlety in politics and history. I sat in his little workshop while he continued to work, and we talked with him for hours on end. The conversation was about the war. The people in our little town have different attitudes. Those who have relatives in the West or in Northern Europe are happy as before. You can't imagine what our soldiers send them from there. Food, fabrics, underwear, dresses. Women who in peacetime could barely buy a pair of stockings now walk around in furs. They don't have to fear for the lives of their husbands and sons. That's how you can endure a war. It's very different for families whose loved ones are on the Eastern Front. They live in perpetual fear. Every day the letter carrier can return their letter to the front with a note, "Fallen on the field of honour." We must learn to read the war reports between the lines. We were thrown far back. At Moscow, as it seems, German blood was pouring out by the river. Take a look at this newspaper. Indeed, what my young chauffeur told me on the way was no exaggeration. The newspaper pages were filled with death notices. Goebbels cannot hide this defeat from the people. He is accused of lying by the stories of vacationers and wounded about the retreat near Moscow. All I can tell you is that the mood is sinking fast, and every day more and more people in our city dream that the war is over. Even some pug, and they've stopped talking about a victorious end. I don't believe we can defeat the Russian bogatier. In his arrogance, Hitler challenged the whole of Europe. What good end can there be? Sitting on the workbench, I listened to the old master. Occasionally he put aside his planer to fill a pipe with tobacco or to put a pole to it, lit from the stove on which he was melting carpenter's glue. Old Hartmann was deeply religious, he went to church carefully, and there was always a Bible on the workbench in front of him. "The communists want nothing to do with religion," he used to say, "so I am against communism. I'm really not in favour of the Russians at all, but I'm not a National Socialist either. If you listen to the vacationers, your hair stands on end. Innocent people are killed, civilians are hanged. I can't agree with that. And what they're doing to the Jews is a disgrace. Why should they be exterminated? They are human beings too, and they do their duty just like we do. No, it won't do any good. And it's a two-front war. We can't take it. World War I showed that. Russia has a huge territory and great human resources. Nothing will manage." I said goodbye to my old acquaintance. However, what I heard from him again gave food to the doubts that deprived me of sleep a few weeks ago after a conversation with General Paulus. Are there many men in the rear who think like this carpenter? I listened to the speeches of those around me, talking to peasants, small traders, labourers, teachers. Most of the time they were cautious with me, avoided answering my questions. In their eyes I was a high-ranking military man. That's what confused me. That's why I couldn't dispel my doubts. However, my wife told me that people here lived in constant fear of the Gestapo. A thoughtless word could get a person arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Mutual distrust reigned everywhere. I also observed a depressed mood in Aachen when I went to visit my brother. Many of my young parents had died at the front, all of them peasant sons who would one day inherit their parents' farm. In the old days, I had enjoyed travelling to my home village to visit relatives and friends. Now I had to express my condolences for their loss. Almost everywhere I met women with weeping faces. On my return from Aachen, I found in Münzberg a telegram from the commandant of the Frankfurt garrison. According to the order of the 6th Army, immediately interrupt your vacation and report tomorrow to the personnel office of the army in Berlin. It was an unpleasant surprise. My wife became quite despondent. How she was happy about my vacation, what plans we had made with her, and now everything was ruined. I packed quickly. The separation was hard on me too. In Nauheim I caught the night train to Berlin. Arriving there in the morning, I went straight to the army personnel office. I was already expected, and the officer on duty immediately escorted me onward to the courier train to Letzen, so I could only greet my brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Wagner, head of department at the Wehrmacht General Staff, by telephone. In Letzen they knew of my arrival. Here I finally learned why I have to interrupt my vacation. I have to fly to Poltava, where the head of the personnel department of the land forces, General Ketel-Sovitsia, meeting of Army adjutants of Army Group South. I spent the night in a special train of General Feldmarschall von Brauchitsch. The train, located in the woods near Letzen, was camouflaged. It consisted of several sleeping cars, a dining car and a parlour car with chairs and a table. The commandant of the train assigned me and my adjutant a separate compartment. When the next morning I got out of the car at the Letzen airfield, General Keitel's personal airplane was already ready for departure for Poltava. The general himself arrived after me, accompanied by several department heads of the Army Personnel Department. Overwhelmed by very different feelings, I waited for the flight. A strong wind came up. We took our seats. The plane started. The lake spread out below us. Already, at an altitude of several hundred meters, we began to chatter. I'd never gotten airsick before, but this one hit me hard. When we made an intermediate landing in Zhytomyr, my legs felt like absorbent cotton. It is quite understandable that I did not have the slightest desire to get out of the car. True, it was more pleasant to fly afterwards, and still, when I felt solid ground under my feet in Poltava, I rejoiced. The meeting began the next morning in the headquarters building of the Army Group. In addition to Keitel and the chiefs of staff departments, the meeting was attended by First Adjutant of Army Group South, Colonel von Weimar, First Adjutants of the 2nd, 6th, 11th and 17th Armies, as well as the 1st and 4th Panzer Armies. We were instructed to ascertain whether the commanders of units and sub-units were fit for their positions, to report those commanders who were failing in their duties to the Personnel Directorate, and submit our ideas as to how they should be utilized in the future, and to recommend candidates to replace them, if possible from officers of the Army concerned. Our 6th Army has proposed to appoint suitable Oberleutnants as battalion commanders, and young proven majors as regimental commanders. In 1 month they would be confirmed as commanders, and in another 2 months they would be promoted to regular rank regardless of length of service. This proposal was approved. The Personnel Directorate recommended that the first adjutants, in case of loss of commanders, follow the example of the 6th Army. I emphasized that early production in the highest ranks would not only raise the prestige of officers in the eyes of their colleagues who had the same rank, but would also spur the ambition of officers. General Keitel demanded that in the Army Group before the beginning of the offensive to create a reserve of command staff of officers of all ranks. By evening the meeting was over. Immediately after it I reported the results to the Chief of Staff and Paulus. Soon all sorts of worries came upon us. There was nothing to think about continuing the vacation. Soon another crisis arose at one of the sites south of Kharkov. The Soviet command, apparently, again tried to break through our defences. The blow was parried by 8.8 caliber anti-aircraft guns and a newly arrived division. However, the Soviet units managed to capture some prisoners from the 44th Infantry Division. Among them was, I forget his last name, a certain Feldfebel, a platoon commander of an infantry regiment. A few days later the division reported, to our surprise, that the captured Feldfebel had returned to his military unit. The division's intelligence department added in its report that the returned Feldfebel was telling everywhere as if the soldiers and officers of the Red Army had treated him well. These reports, which were contrary to our propaganda, caused considerable excitement in the intelligence department of the Army headquarters. I was present when the head of the department reported the incident at the discussion of the situation with the Chief of Staff. He had already ordered to bring the field officer to the Army headquarters, accompanied by one of the officers, because the story seemed to him very mysterious. Interrogated by the intelligence officer, the Feldfebel reported that he had managed to escape from captivity. Nevertheless, the prisoners, according to him, were treated humanely. and in the front units, and later in higher authorities, in the headquarters where they were interrogated, the prisoners had plenty of everything: food, drink, smoke. And the fact that the prisoners were allegedly beaten or shot on the spot was not even in the past. All this seemed implausible to us. The head of the intelligence department believed that the field feeble was sent to his unit in order to demoralize it. Even if it is not so, his stay there undermines the morale of the unit. Therefore, he proposed to transfer the field officer to a reserve unit with a categorical prohibition to send him to the Eastern Front. The proposal was accepted. This measure could not prevent the lively discussions that arose in the division about the incident. Most of them were of the opinion that the prisoner had been sent back on a specific mission, and that was why he had been treated so well. Only a few believed his report. But we never knew what really happened. The incident with the field fleet gave food for conversation among the officers of the army staff. I quite admitted that in this case it was not an escape from captivity, but I doubted whether it was advisable to transfer the field sergeant to the reserve units, and I told Paulus about it. Would we not thereby cause an undesirable discussion in the regiment, and perhaps even in the division? After all, Field Feeble received a good characteristic from his company commander. He is known as an exemplary, faithful to his duty soldier who always behaved well. He has not had a single reprimand. He is respected by both his superiors and the rest of the company. It seems to me that this is when the very unpleasant conversations we want to avoid will begin. Many soldiers will begin to doubt the truthfulness of our propaganda. The commander thought for a moment, then answered, "Let's try to take the side of the one who returned from captivity, assuming that he had no special assignment. Even then his stay in the unit poses a certain danger. He would have to give explanations all the time. The turn the circumstances have taken favours enemy propaganda. That's why I agree with the proposal of our counterintelligence department." I also spoke to the officer who was conducting the interrogation and told him my concerns. He smiled. We also foresaw this danger and therefore informed the division as follows. An additional check at the army headquarters showed that everything that the field feeble told was not true. Most likely, he had received an assignment from the Russians to incite his comrades to desert. I was numb with astonishment. Then asked, "Is this quite credible?" "Of course it is not literally so," replied the officer. "But I am of the opinion that in this way the discussion of this story will be put to rest." For a long time afterwards I pondered over the manner and methods with which this problem had been dealt with. Of course, even here there was a contradiction between our official propaganda and reality. All of us constantly insinuated to our soldiers that the Russian does not leave prisoners alive. He interrogates them and kills them immediately. Meanwhile, the field officer told about German soldiers who were captured back in 1941. They, according to him, lived well. Who should we believe? The paramedic gave the names and military unit of the soldiers he saw and talked to on the other side of the front. This information could be verified. It would be easy to expose him as a liar. But what purpose did the Reds pursue by sending back our platoon commander? What was his actual assignment? And as it happens, when thoughts wander, another impression came to my mind, remembered to me in our headquarters. Colonel von Bechtolsheim, Chief of Staff of the King's Army Corps, was assigned to France as Chief of Staff of the First Army. His successor, Colonel General Staff Kinzel, formerly Chief of the Foreign Armies Division of the General Staff of the Land Forces, came to report his arrival to Paulus, and we invited him to dine with us. In conversation, Paulus expressed bewilderment at the fact that the General Command of Land Forces, especially Hitler, claims as if the Red Army destroyed. After all, that this is out of the question. Prove the actions of the Red Army since January, especially near Moscow and here at our place. What's your opinion, Kinzel? My department has never supported Hitler's thesis, which he repeated many times, that the Red Army is defeated. In my reports I have constantly pointed out to the Führer that according to the information available to us, which has been verified in every possible way, The Soviet Union is only now beginning to deploy its full military power. It has formed numerous new armies. Its military industry is in full swing. But about this, Hitler did not want to hear, because the reality diverges from his dreams. With one wave of his hand, he swept our reports off the table. It really sounded disappointing. If the commander-in-chief in his decisions are based on such incorrect assumptions, there is no telling what unforeseen consequences it will lead to. But why do the generals in the General Command of the Army and Wehrmacht condone this? Why does the General Staff condone the spread of such disinformation? It is madness to base war strategy and tactics on false propaganda. Is such criminal frivolity really possible? This question did not leave my mind. But I did not dream, even in my worst dreams, what a painful way I would come to the knowledge of the truth. Above all, I trusted Paulus. He would not indulge in carelessness, accepting such an irresponsibly underestimation of the enemy. He would be guided by his common sense. This he proved immediately in the first weeks when he took command of the Sixth Army. I considered it impossible and even dangerous to discuss my doubts with my superiors or with comrades of equal rank. True, I just then got acquainted with one officer whose straightforwardness attracted me, the new head of the Army Engineers, Colonel Zelle. But we knew each other still too little. Besides, he wore the gold badge of a member of the Nazi Party. Despite the critical remarks that he sometimes expressed, I then considered him a staunch supporter of Hitler. Only with the passage of time did I find out that Zell himself had doubts about many things at that time and had suffered severe disillusionment with Hitler's strategy. Later we became friends. There was a big offensive in the summer of 1942. The General Command of Land Forces attached to the headquarters of the Sixth Army as a liaison officer Major General Staff Menzel. Thanks to his modesty and ability to keep silent, he very soon established contact with the operations department and enjoyed general confidence. Shortly before the start of hostilities, we were given another surprise. One of the leading figures of the Ministry of Propaganda, Fritzsche, was seconded to our headquarters as a war correspondent. He came to introduce himself to Paulus in the uniform of a Sonderführer, which corresponds to the rank of captain. After our usual afternoon walk, I sat at Colonel Felter's, the head of our operations department. In conversation with him, I asked, why was it necessary to send one of Goebbels's closest collaborators to us? Apparently, the Supreme Headquarters are waiting for a break in the course of the war. In the troops and in the rear, our failure near Moscow has shaken the belief in the proximity of the victorious end. The mood is low not only in our army. With the help of special correspondence about the victories on the Eastern Front, the High Command wants to raise the mood. By destroying the Russian troops that broke through south of Kharkov, and most importantly, by launching an offensive this summer, we must give food for new victory reports. Goebbels' collaborator Fritzsche was given the task of writing incendiary reports. He immediately, as soon as he arrived, asked us to name him soldiers and young officers who distinguished themselves in the defensive battles. But you know it yourself, concluded my interlocutor. As far as I know, Felter, he visits you often. Of course he does. He tries to dig up material in the morning and evening bulletins, from which he can make up something for the press and radio. The first fruits of his labours are already visible. In the Kiev Soldiers newspaper, I read his very cleverly made frontline sketches. He really knows how to portray the everyday as heroic. And what soldier would not be flattered that his name is mentioned in the newspaper? It would be interesting to see if our war reporter would be as active when a real fight breaks out. That's what I'm asking myself. Well, we'll see. By the way, I think he was also sent here as an informant, and since we have enough to do without him, we'll send him to the divisions. Wherever, but there he'll be able to hear the noise of battle with his own ears. You know, Felter, I do not envy you. Now you have a double job, to prepare the destruction of the enemy, who broke through our positions south of Kharkov, and in addition to make a plan for the big summer offensive. It's really not the most pleasant. Adjutant of the army group told me that here have already sent various divisions, restaffed in France for the summer offensive. Let us hope that we will not need to save the situation south and north of Kharkov by using these divisions as fire teams, so to speak. Soviet intelligence activity has intensified in both places of encroachment during the past few days. Corps commanders are very alarmed. They are pressing for reinforcements as they expect the enemy to go on the offensive. Hitler's Directive No. 41 of April 5, 1942, defined for Army Group South goals of the summer offensive of 1942. The implementation of a set of operations should begin with an offensive from the area south of Orel in the direction of Voronezh. For this purpose were intended 2nd 4th Panzer Army and 2nd Hungarian Army. The task of our 6th Army was to break through from the area of Kharkov to the east, and in cooperation with moving down the Don motorized units of the 4th Tank Army, to destroy the enemy forces in the interfluve of the Don and Volga. After that, in the third phase of the summer offensive, the 6th Army and the 4th Tank Army were to join in the area of Stalingrad with the forces advancing eastward from Taganrog and Artemovsk. Having reached Stalingrad, it was necessary to destroy this important military-industrial centre and the largest hub of communication routes. At the conclusion of the operation was envisaged breakthrough through the Caucasus Ridge. It was clear that Hitler was hungry for the richest oil sources, which in addition were decisive for the further conduct of the war. In early May, some divisions expected from France arrived in the Kharkov area, including the 305th Constance Division, and with it my then unknown-to-me co-author, my future friend Otto Rühler, who served in the motorized ambulance company. Preparation for the transfer of our troops for the summer campaign of 1942 was in full swing. But to the share of the 6th Army fell another heavy test. On May 12th, the Soviet formations, having considerable forces, including numerous tanks, undertook a new offensive from the Izium protrusion and near Volchansk. A threatening situation was created for us. Striking Soviet troops managed to break through our defences in a number of areas. 454th Guard Division did not resist the onslaught. Happened that Paulus feared even on March 1. The division retreated. We had to withdraw 10 kilometres back and VII Army Corps, as the Hungarian Guard Brigade, under the command of Major General Apt, could not resist the advancing enemy. Soviet tanks stood 20 kilometres from Kharkov. True, the 3rd and 23rd Panzer Divisions tried to make a counterattack, but without success. Almost as serious was the situation at Volchansk, northeast of Kharkov. It was necessary to put into battle literally the last reserves of the 6th Army to delay the enemy. But then came a breakthrough. On May 17th, the Army Group Kleist with the 3 Tank Corps under the command of General von Mackensen approached the Izium Bulge from the south. At the same time, the 6th Army launched a big offensive from the north. In a fierce struggle managed to encircle the advancing Soviet formations. It was 2 exhausting weeks. Neither day nor night we did not take off our boots, not to mention our clothes. On May 29th, the spring battle for Kharkov was over. The dangerous breakthrough at Izium was liquidated. Paulus received the Knight's Cross. The command centre of the army was transferred from Poltava to Kharkov. Impatiently waited for Sonderführer Fritzsche, the beginning of operations near Kharkov. Then his pen strobed, supplying the rear with brilliant, inspiring correspondence from the battlefield. They gave vigour to many a doubtful and downcast German. In the memory of many people pale the horrors of the fierce Russian winter, failures near Moscow and in the Crimea. Probably Fritzsche thought that everyone will be pleased, placing in the Soldier's newspaper, published in Kiev, an article in which he glorified as a great commander Paulus, at that time received the title of General of Tank Forces. Our last victory, wrote Fritzsche, we owe primarily to the careful and purposeful leadership of Paulus. I remember how happy and proud we were in the army headquarters, reading this article. The Sonderführer immediately won, in our opinion. However, the Minister of Propaganda, Dr. Goebbels, reacted differently. On the day that we were delivered an issue of this newspaper, we were still sitting at the table after dinner. Fritzsche was called to the telephone. He came back with a red, flaming face. What had happened? Goebbels had given him a headbutt for praising Paulus as a military leader. In the great German Empire, this epithet applies to only one man, the Führer and Reich Chancellor Adolf Hitler. Fritzsche stayed in the Sixth Army for a few more months. As far as I know, he never once again penalized before his superiors. When Paulus learned of the incident, he was angry. What only these people do, as if that's the most important thing, and that we sat in a shoe mainly because the High Command underestimated the enemy, they do not realize. In my opinion, Mr. General, the strangest thing is that the defeats are attributed entirely to the commanders of armies, or groups of armies. General Guderian, for example, after the defeat at Moscow was removed and sent to the rear, but we owe our victories primarily to the Führer's commanding skill. My dear Adam, I hope you're not expressing these red thoughts in the presence of Mr. Fritzsche. I wouldn't want you to get into trouble. I'll be careful, Mr. General. At the beginning of May 1942, there was a change in the 6th Army Operations Department. At the request of the commander of Army Group South, General Field Marshal von Bock was removed from his post, Chief of Staff of the Army Geheim, a few days before that received the rank of Major General. According to Bock, Geheim was not at the height in the difficult situation created in the spring of 1942. He allegedly too pessimistic about the consequences of the breakthrough of the enemy at Volchanskom. Paulus told me that he did not agree with this decision, but he did nothing to prevent Geheim's resignation. I was very much struck by this measure towards Major General Geheim. I considered him a capable officer. All the chiefs of departments of the army staff worked with him amicably and regretted his departure. Geheim took command of the 44th Armored Division, and his successor in the army staff was Colonel General Arthur Schmidt. Was it reasonable such a replacement in the midst of the preparation of the offensive, on the eve of the summer offensive operation? Even Paulus took it disapprovingly, especially when the Oberquartermeister, responsible for all the supply, Colonel General Staff Pampel, was removed, and instead of him appointed Colonel General Staff Fink. Schmidt and Fink needed to familiarize themselves with the attitudes of their predecessors in a short period of time. Schmidt succeeded very soon. The son of a merchant, a native of Hamburg, he was a man intelligent, flexible, endowed with great savvy, which was combined with hardness, which, however, often turned into stubbornness. And, most importantly, there was between him and the former chief of one significant difference. Geheim was able to maintain good relations with all departments of the army staff. He was a soldier, and above all demanded from each of his co-workers to observe discipline and obey his orders without question, but he was responsible for each department head and helped him in any situation. In contrast, Schmidt was intolerant and arrogant, cold and ruthless. Most often he imposed his will, rarely considered the opinion of others. Between him and the heads of departments of his staff repeatedly clashed, especially with the head of the operational department, with the chief of the Oberquartermeister and the chief of engineers of the army. This by no means accelerated the last preparations for the summer offensive. Many officers of our staff sought transfer to other parts. Paulus was aware of the antipathy which inspired the chief of staff. At the slightest opportunity, Paulus tried to smooth out these rough edges, did not seriously put before himself the question of replacing the chief of staff. I regretted that a qualified General Staff Schmidt does not know how to establish contact with the army environment. Even to Paulus he treated not as he should have. Schmidt tried to lord it over the commander. This was realized, and corps commanders, who took Schmidt with a broken heart. The army needs replenishment in the battles for Kharkov. 6th Army suffered a very tangible damage, losing 20,000 people killed and wounded. My task was to close the gaps as soon as possible with the help of new reinforcements. After all, in the upcoming summer offensive should take part fully staffed divisions. In the rear were sent requests to the headquarters of military districts. In a few days it was reported that the first echelons were on their way. In Tsarkov, daily received replenishment, which was poured into the divisions. Arrived, and the last, newly formed in France divisions, as well as the headquarters of the LT Army Corps, headed by General of Artillery von Seydlitz-Kurzbach. The division commanders reported to Paulus at his command post in Kharkov. Adjutants handed me lists of officers with the indication of their positions. Among the division commanders were two old acquaintances of our commander, Lieutenant General Enneke, commander of the 389th Infantry Division, and Lieutenant General von Gablenz, commander of the 384th Infantry Division. Paulus had a long conversation with them. He was primarily interested in the level of combat training, combat qualities and experience, especially regimental commanders. I was present at the report of Lieutenant General Enneke. His report was disappointing. Jenneke's division was almost entirely composed of soldiers who had no or very little experience of warfare in the East. This was the case even with the commanders of infantry regiments. These were senior officers who had been at the disposal of the Manning service in the past. They had then undergone a course of training at the Mourmelon range in France, after which they were appointed as commanders. They are, of course, not yet commanders, as they have no experience in either troop development or command. Two of them, in my opinion, are not physically able to cope with the difficulties ahead, General Jenneke remarked. I would be grateful if you would give me two experienced battalion commanders instead, and I will provide the personnel department with an explanation for the replacement of these two regimental commanders. This is not required, Mr. General, I replied. We have a directive to check the suitability of all commanders again before the beginning of the offensive, and we have been authorized to carry out the necessary reshuffling. The very next day, both senior officers were replaced by others, and they were enrolled in the Command Staff Reserve. If this problem could still be solved simply and quickly, it was much more difficult to fill the gaps that arose during the fighting. And above all, this applied to the replenishment of the rank and file. Winter and spring battles on the Eastern Front cost us huge losses. I think that the Wehrmacht losses in the winter of 1941–42 were up to 500,000. The problem of replenishment was very serious already at the beginning of the offensive in 1942. But it began to inspire horror at the thought of those distant goals, which delirious Supreme Command. June 1st, 1942, at the headquarters of Army Group South in Poltava, held an expanded meeting of commanders. Hitler appeared accompanied by Field Marshal General Keitel, Chief of Operations Lieutenant General Hosinger, General Quartermaster General Wagner, and many adjutants. Invited to the meeting were Field Marshal General von Bock, Commander of Army Group South, Infantry General von Zodenstern, Chief of Staff of Army Group South, Lieutenant General von Greifenberg, later Chief of Staff of Army Group A, Colonel General von Kleist, Commander of the 1st Panzer Army, Colonel General Ruoff, Commander of the 17th Army, Colonel General Baron von Weichs, Commander of the 2nd Army, Colonel General Goth, Commander of the 4th Tank Army, General of Armoured Forces, Paulus, Commander of the 6th Army, General of Armoured Forces von Mackensen, Commander of the Thethalen Tank Corps, and from the Air Force, Colonel General von Richthofen, Commander of the 4th Air Fleet. Discussed the plan of action in the southern direction. Hitler clarified the goals of the offensive, outlined in the directive of April 5, 1942. He led a big game, about which he himself remarked, "If we do not take Maikop and Grozny, I will have to stop the war." In southern Russia, west of the Don, a major operation was planned to encircle and destroy the main forces of the Red Army. With the success of this operation would open access to the Volga and the Caucasus with its oil sources and, according to Hitler's plan, would be a fatal blow to the Soviet Union. Paulus informed our operational department on the upcoming operations, which from the side of Germany and its allies were to participate in more than 1.5 million soldiers, over 1,000 aircraft and several thousand guns of all calibers. The 6th Army initially received the task of providing the flank of the tank group advancing on Stalingrad. Our commander gave us confidence. We all went to work with renewed vigour. Although during the previous operation code-named Frederick the Foe was destroyed Izium Ledge, it was necessary to take measures to create a more favourable initial position for the Sixth Army. On June 13th, a blow to Volchansk, called Operation Wilhelm, was undertaken, and on June 22nd, a blow to Kupiansk together with the 3rd Tank Corps, which then remained subordinate to the Sixth Army. Tanks rumbled forward. Infantry and artillery took their initial positions. After a short, massive fire attack from hundreds of guns, our troops broke forward, closing the pincers. Within a few days, the encircled compounds were defeated. Past the German troops moving to new starting positions, 20,000 prisoners were paraded to our rear. June 19th, after a busy day at work, I sat in the room of Colonel Felter. He was selecting reports from the Corps to pass them on to the Army Group. It was about 20 o'clock. At this minute the phone rang. Felter urgently called the Chief of the Operational Department of the XXXXXXX Tank Corps. "Connect immediately." The meaning of the ensuing long conversation I could not grasp. However, I noticed that Felter's face increasingly gloomy. He rattled his pipe with irritation. Just what we needed. Knocked down Fizela Storch with the Chief of Operations of the 23rd Division, Major Reichel. He was carrying maps and orders for the first period of our offensive. I was so confused that I could not ask anything. Little by little, I realized what Felter had hastily explained to me in a few words. After the meeting held at the XXXXXX Tank Corps in Kharkov, Major Reichel decided to return to his division on the Fizela Storch. But it was getting dark, and he had not yet returned. The liaison officer called Corps headquarters to see if Reichel flew back late. But this assumption was not justified. The Tank Corps immediately organized a search for the missing officer. Then one of the divisions reported the sad news that in the afternoon the enemy shot down some Fizela Storch behind the front line. Infantry reconnaissance teams found the plane about 4 kilometers from our front line. Apparently he made an emergency landing, because during the shelling he was punctured gas tank. The corpses of Major Reichel and the pilot were picked up there, and the orders and maps disappeared without a trace. They were seized by the Russians. This threatened fatal consequences also because the orders had information about the upcoming operations of neighbours on the left, the Second Army and the 4th Panzer Army. Hitler intervened in this case. The commander of the Corps, General of Tank Forces Stumme, his Chief of Staff, Colonel Franz, and the commander of the 23rd Panzer Division, Lieutenant General von Beuneberg, were dismissed from their posts and put on trial. For them immediately stood up for General Paulus and Field Marshal von Bock, as all three were not directly responsible for what had happened. This made no impression on either Hitler or Göring, that is, the presidents of the military court. Stumme was sentenced to 5 years, and Franz to 3 years of imprisonment in a fortress. Only von Beuneberg escaped punishment. Reichel case gave rise to Hitler's order, according to which no commander henceforth should not know about the tasks assigned to neighbouring units. This order had to be observed with such a blunt formalism that it made it extremely difficult to coordinate combat operations. The commander of the XXXXXX Tank Corps was appointed General of Tank Forces von Schweppenberg. If even he had the necessary experience and ability, still this replacement just before the start of the big offensive was harmful. Each new commander needs a certain time until he learned to firmly hold everything in his hands and win the confidence of his subordinate parts. Paulus and Bock were particularly concerned also because XXXXX Tank Corps was to pave the way for the army in a large bend of the Don and prevent the withdrawal of the enemy for the Don. In addition, both commanders and personally hurt by the verdict of the court, because in their opinion only Reichel acted frivolously. Thus, the Reichel affair and the reprisal that completed it were weighing over the upcoming offensive as a threat of heavy retribution. There was much debate about this in our army headquarters. Can we even carry out our Operation Blue Tea in the form in which it was planned and on time? I asked Felter. The enemy is not stupid. He will try to spoil us in every possible way. Of course, we must be prepared for unpleasant surprises. But what can we do? We can't change the plan. To change it would mean delaying operations for weeks. And then winter will come, and something worse than what happened last year near Moscow will happen to us. This takes into account and OKH and the command of the Army Group. A few days later, Paulus informed us that the Army Group objects to the change of plan, but requires to push back the date of the offensive. Meanwhile, the Führer Propaganda Fritsche was not idle. The successes of the Sixth Army in the defensive battle near Kharkov, the elimination of the areas of encirclement and subsequent battles, which contributed to the improvement of our initial position, were presented in close-up in military correspondence for radio and press. Say, the armed forces of Germany are going to new feats, new victories. Winter defeats will not be repeated. The forces of the Red Army are fading. Its attacks at Izium and Volchansk were the last flash. They were crushed by the fire of our glorious weapons, shattered by the counter-offensive of our brave soldiers. But propaganda had another function. It indoctrinated officers and soldiers on a daily basis that, if captured, a German would certainly get a bullet in the back of the head, and that it was therefore necessary to sell one's life as dearly as possible. These statements achieved their purpose. I, too, generally believed them. True, sometimes I was reminded of that field sergeant of the 44th Infantry Division who had returned from captivity and told me that the Russians treated prisoners of war well. But who knows from what motives he was spreading such information? And why should I puzzle over it, since I would never be in such a situation myself? The decisive offensive was about to begin, and I had to concentrate all my thoughts on it. The Sixth Army was subordinate to Army Group South, and that the General Command of Land Forces. After Hitler in December 1941 deposed Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, he took over, in addition to the command of the Wehrmacht and the command of ground forces, everywhere in the higher headquarters, with the impression that Hitler with some distrust of most of the generals. It was also said that this suspicion is especially trying to maintain in him Goebbels, Göring, and Himmler. Unbridled power hunger and the dictator's eternal fear of being sidelined or in any way infringed undoubtedly contributed to the fact that he treated the generals of the old school suspiciously. This had to be experienced by Field Marshal General von Bock as well. In fact, he, as well as other generals, provided Hitler with valuable services. During the Polish campaign, he led in the rank of Colonel General of the Northern Group of Armies. In the Western campaign, 9 months later, von Bock commanded Army Group B, which invaded the neutral countries of Holland and Belgium. By the end of this campaign, he had been promoted to Field Marshal General, less smoothly passed in 1941 under von Bock operations of Army Group Center in Russia. He failed to take Moscow, although he put in motion the last battalion. As early as December 2nd, 1941, he said in one of his orders, "The enemy's defence is on the verge of crisis." In reality, this assessment was appropriate not to characterize the enemy's defence, but his own offensive capabilities. When the Red Army launched a counter-offensive on December 5, 1941, the German troops were thrown back several hundred kilometres, suffering extremely heavy losses. Bock then filed a report of illness. Hitler appointed Field Marshal General von Kluge as commander of Army Group Center. A few weeks after the death of Reichenau von Bock, headed Army Group South. At first, things went no better here than at Moscow. He could not prevent the Red Army troops to wedge in on both sides of Izium. From this, his authority, already very discredited in the eyes of Hitler after the defeat at Moscow, suffered even more. It must be that the experience of the winter of 1941–42 taught Field Marshal to judge the Soviet troops a little more soberly. His assessments became more cautious. Just like Paulus, he did not think that the Red Army defeated. Thus, in the spring of 1942, he believed that she every day could try to repel Kharkov. Serious disagreements between him and Hitler arose in connection with the plan to equalize the front to eliminate interfering with our summer offensive protrusions on both sides of Kharkov. While the Field Marshal intended to wipe out the ledge at Izium in the area southwest of the Donets, Hitler demanded that the Sixth Army should take the offensive from the north. While Bock wanted to take advantage of the favourable weather, immediately attack the enemy broke through northwest of Kharkov. Hitler put the beginning of the offensive depends on when we take away from the Russian Kerch Peninsula. We at headquarters were aware of these discrepancies. I learned about them from Felter. A pretext to get rid of the unwanted Field Marshal, Hitler found soon. July 7th, Army Group South was ordered by Hitler divided into two groups of armies, A and B. The command of Army Group A received Field Marshal General List, and the command of Army Group B, Colonel General von Weichs. Field Marshal General von Bock did not receive any assignment. He was retired from the army. The summer offensive begins. At the end of June 1942, Army Group South, consisting of the 17th Army, 1st Panzer Army, 6th Army, 4th Panzer Army, 2nd Army, 2nd Hungarian Army and 1 Italian Army Corps, stood on the 800-kilometre front line ready for the offensive. Day X was set. The Army command post was located in a former student dormitory on the northern outskirts of Kharkov. From this imposing brick building, Paulus supposed to lead the breakthrough of the Red Army positions. The Army Signal Regiment was ordered to pull the communication line following the XXXX Tank Corps. 2nd Army, 4th Panzer Army and 2nd Hungarian Army, united in the Army Group Weichs, began June 28th offensive at Voronezh. At the same time Maid and XXXXX Tank Corps. In the area north of Volchansk, he unexpectedly met strong resistance. The Russians dug into the ground many tanks, around which fiercely fought infantry. The resistance temporarily delayed the advancing XXXX Tank Corps. It gave the Soviet troops a few precious hours, which they used to rest. On July 1, after a short but strong artillery preparation, the infantry divisions of the 6th Army went on the offensive. On July 3, the Red Army units that had resisted stubbornly near Oskol were knocked out of their positions. By forced march, making 30–40 kilometres daily, the German divisions moved to the east. However, the hope for success did not come true. From the very first days we had to recognise that we fought only with a numerically weak but well-armed rear guard. Its fierce resistance caused us great damage. The main forces of the Soviet troops were able to avoid the destruction that threatened them. Already on the second day of the offensive, the operational department of the 6th Army relocated its command post to the area behind the former positions of the Soviet units. With excitement, we waited every evening for the operational report of the General Command of the Land Forces, which was received by Radio Intelligence Department and presented to the commander. We were quite surprised when we heard about our tremendous successes. From the summary was clear as follows. The enemy armies opposing Army Group South delivered a crushing blow. Headquarters of the 6th Army assessed these initial successes much more soberly. If we had won, then on such a huge front it would be expressed in hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The battlefields would be strewn with dead and wounded. We would have mountains of captured weapons and various military equipment. In reality, the picture was quite different. Only at Oskol we managed to take several thousand prisoners. The rest of the data reported by the divisions on the number of prisoners could not be taken into account. On the battlefield, we found few killed and wounded Red Army fighters, and heavy weapons and transport the Soviet troops took away with them. In addition, the XXXX Tank Corps, which on July 4th turned to the southeast and was advancing along the Don, was unable to block the path of the retreating Soviet troops. The corps reached the Don at Korotoyak. 2 days later it was west of Novaya Kalitva, and on July 9th it was already east of Kantemirovka. His 3 divisions stretched over a great distance. Their advance was often hindered by lack of fuel, so that the Russians were always leaving through wide gaps and avoided encirclement. One day, after a sweltering day, I was walking with General Paulus in front of the command post. We were enjoying the evening coolness. The commander started the conversation. "You rightly have already noticed that the goal we set, the destruction of the enemy, has not been achieved. Our offensive was beating past the target, in vain. I suspect that the most difficult task is still ahead. After all, XXX tank corps and later will hardly be able to catch up and encircle the enemy. To cope with this task would be possible if the 4th Tank Army advanced into a large bend of the Don and advancing in conjunction with XSXXX Tank Corps. But as it is still confined to Voronezh, although the Army Group Wykes, and sparing no effort, has not yet managed to occupy the entire city and block the railroad line leading to Stalingrad. However, the Chief of Staff recently informed me that Hitler has now decided to turn the 4th Panzer Army to the southeast. Let's hope that he will do it soon. In the meantime, the Army Command was pushing for infantry divisions to establish direct contact with the Tank Corps as soon as possible. The offensive continued unabated. Pursue the retreating enemy on his heels, being in contact with him. This was the task that Paulus put before the infantry corps. Army command post often changed location, followed directly behind the divisions to be able to directly affect the pace of the offensive. Army Communications Regiment on other days was ordered to move the main army wire and army telephone exchange immediately several dozen kilometres forward. With XXXX Tank Corps maintained only radio communication, Paulus every day travelled to divisions, encouraging troops to accelerate the pace of the offensive. They had to squeeze out of themselves the last forces. Battles were continuously replaced by marches. Night rest was short. Donetsk and Oskol remained far behind. Before us lay the wide Don steppe. The July sun baked mercilessly from the azure sky, scorching the marching columns in dust clouds. There was not a road, not a tree or a bush that would give shade, not a stream to quench their thirst. Everywhere, wherever one looked, there were only wormwood and sagebrush, and legions of gophers scurrying between them. And yet this landscape, for all its monotony, had a special charm. I have seldom seen such a beautiful sunset as here. It seemed as if the whole steppe were aflame. The air was filled with spicy aromas. The tall grass came to life, grasshoppers crackled, gophers whistled, birds sang their evening song. Then the night plunged all around into deep silence, and only separate rifle shots of the field guard cut through the silence like the snap of a whip. It was a very sparsely populated region. Villages were almost always found, only in rare stretching from north to south wide ravines, valleys of streams, which made themselves known from afar by low hillocks. These villages were almost empty. Their inhabitants had left, driving their cattle after the retreating Red Army units. The houses, if they had not been damaged or destroyed by our tanks and artillery, were in good condition, clean and well maintained. In such a village among the wide Don steppe our command post was located. The operations department occupied the house where the school used to be. Its entrances were barricaded as usual. On July 9th, the Chief of Staff of the 4th Tank Army came to us on a Fieseler stalk. Her staff was ordered to take command of the XXXX Tank Corps, drawn out in fierce fighting near Kantemirovka. Chief of Staff led a reconnaissance team. He reported that on the instructions of the High Command of the 4th Tank Army is already moving to the southeast. In doing so, it will have to cross the offensive strip of the 6th Army. If no action is taken, the troops of both armies may move. Therefore, the headquarters need to coordinate their actions. Such an agreement was soon reached. Chief of Staff of the Tank Army went to the XXSX Tank Corps, which managed to overcome Soviet resistance at Kantemirovka. On July 11th, he went to the Chir near Bukovskaya. On the same day, XXXX Tank Corps was transferred to the 4th Tank Army. the Sixth Army was deprived of its striking and most mobile connection. Now it no longer had the opportunity to catch up with the retreating enemy. On July 13th, the 4th Tank Army was ordered to turn south from Chir, to block the Soviet troops retreating in front of the 17th and 1st Tank Armies, the way to the east, to create a bridgehead on the left bank of the Don, and then together with the 1st Tank Army to seize Rostov. Just at that moment I was at Paulus with a report. He had just learned of this decision. Excited, he paced back and forth in his room. Lost the advantage that gave us XXXX Tank Corps. We are from Chir at a distance of several days' crossings. To turn the Tank Corps south in this situation is to force us to retake the same territory. Consequently, Mr. General, we are expected to perform such feats, which, according to previous concepts, could have been done by 4 armies. Unfortunately, that's true. Left to itself, the Sixth Army must continue the offensive in the Great Bend of the Don, and at the same time to take over the defence of the northern flank, which is day by day increasingly stretched. I heard from Felter that part of our task will take over the Second Hungarian Army, I noticed. That's right, Adam, but most of the Hungarians are still standing in the area south of Voronezh. They operated there as part of Weich's army group. It will be some time before the Hungarian divisions are withdrawn from their positions and can take the place of our divisions on the Don. So, we will continue the offensive on Stalingrad without tanks. Judging by preliminary data coming from headquarters, we will receive a tank corps, probably the 14th. I hope this will happen without delay. Even a very great optimist would not seem rosy prospects for the Sixth Army. Only July 20th, we crossed the Chir in its upper reaches near Bukovskaya, in the place where 9 days ago stood XXXX Tank Corps. For further advance in the Don Bend were created 2 strike groups, the northern from the Khast V Tank Corps, which meanwhile passed into our subordination, and Fei Army Corps, and the southern group from Li Army Corps. Divisions that provided the northern flank were subordinate to the 17th Army Corps. Now the shock vanguard of the 6th Army was the 13th Panzer Corps. On July 23rd, German divisions broke into a large bend of the Don south of Kremenskaya, and in a short time reached Sirotinskaya. But this was again a blow for nothing. The Soviet troops withdrew behind the Don.